Go for it.
Okay. Good evening. I'm very, very happy to be with you this evening. I had the privilege of meeting Marguerite Bourgeoys when I was a student in secondary school in the United States. The congregation's educational philosophy formed me and shapes the reflections that I will offer you this evening. I hope that these reflections will bring honor to the legacy of this pioneering woman who showed great courage and daring in her time, and tonight calls us to be courageous in listening to the calls and challenges that Pope Francis lays before us. As a teacher for many years, I will begin by sharing an overview of my presentation. After a brief introduction, I want to talk a little bit about Visitation Spirituality, then the invitation of Pope Francis, some contemporary global perspectives that form the need for a new look at education, the characteristics of the Global Compact, the mission of the Global Compact, the commitments and research themes related to the Compact, and then I hope that we will have some time to reflect and share together. In September of 2019, Pope Francis announced his initiative entitled the Global Compact on Education. Hoping to meet with educators and other leaders in the spring of 2020, Pope Francis began a dialogue on the importance of relooking at the education of young people. In his invitation, we hear the elements that form the basis of his compact. It is for and with young people. It's an education that is open and inclusive, characterized by patient listening, constructive dialogue, and better mutual understanding. This effort can only be done by a broad alliance of educators and leaders of society working together in order to form individuals who are capable of overcoming division and antagonism. And all of this is for the sake of building a more fraternal humanity, remembering that we are brothers and sisters together. If we take a look at the logo for the Global Compact, we are invited to ponder this invitation visually. The green color recalls nature and growth, renewal, and the possibility of sowing prophetic dreams. The blue recalls a spiritual dimension and our hope to achieve peace. The gold represents light and the sacred. Every pact, every alliance for the common good, for the good of humanity, has something sacred in it. The world is embraced by the human figure who protects and guards it. The circular line symbolizes the macrocosm, that is God, the beginning and the end of everything. As a member of the Congregation of Notre Dame, I am inspired by a spirituality of visitation. Marguerite Bourgeoys invited her sisters to imitate the life of the journeying Virgin throughout her time on earth. The first chapter of the Gospel of St. Luke introduces us to Mary of Nazareth, who has two significant encounters. The first is with the angel Gabriel, the Annunciation, and then her subsequent journey and revelatory encounter with her cousin Elizabeth, the Visitation. The power of the Holy Spirit moves throughout these moments of revelation and encounter. I would like to share a brief overview of the spirituality of visitation that stirred my interest in Pope Francis' invitation to join together to re-envision the education that's needed today for the life of the world. I thank Sister Lorraine Kaza, who is with us, who many of you know and respect. Sister Lorraine has gifted the congregation with her scholarship, and her reflections help us to understand better our spiritual heritage of visitation. Contemporary visitations recognize the power of the Spirit of God that leads people to go in haste toward others in order to journey with them, to accompany and reassure them at moments of need in their life. These moments of visitation, filled with the light of the Holy Spirit, lead us to see what is beautiful, marvel at it, and give thanks. At the same time, a spirit of love requires the visitation traveler to keep her eyes open to intolerance, injustice, and violence. Visitation spirituality is characterized by three interconnected elements. The visitation meeting is a meeting between two biblical women that celebrates the uniqueness of each person and calls for the recognition that all human encounters are opportunities to experience the sanctity of another. This experience is an invitation to see each person as a gift. Each encounter challenges the visitor to open her arms to welcome God's power working in the life of another. Being open to the needs of another draws the individual to seek greater communion with those seeking freedom. Is this person in a situation of fragility, of oppression, of exclusion? What roads do I need to walk in order to strengthen my communion with her? In a visitation encounter, the good of the other is a central focus of attention. No other distraction should interfere with the urgency for greater communion. Mutuality emphasizes that each person has something to offer. A visitation moment invites each person to be open to the hidden riches in the other and inquires participants to release prejudices that the weak or poor person has nothing to offer. The spiritual encounter of Mary and Elizabeth in the Gospel of Luke is a mutual recognition of the power of God in the miraculous life growing within each woman. The meeting is reciprocal. Elizabeth needs Mary as Mary needs Elizabeth, so that what God has done within each of them can be fully understood and proclaimed. Visitation spirituality leads to greater freedom if the journey engenders greater interdependence. This interdependence invites an attitude of mutuality. No one is an expert who showers another with knowledge, while the recipient has little to offer. Mutuality and interdependence require attentive listening to each person, the most fragile to the greatest master. It is necessary to listen to their words, their attitudes, and their silence. Global spirituality also invites us to be open to different ways of thinking, speaking, and acting. It is essential to be attentive to the concerns that are wider than one's own family, locality, or nation. To value the primacy of the human person requires solidarity with people and their concerns. This leads to an awareness that the plight of another is not alien from my own. There are no strangers on the visitation journey. All are companions on the road to greater freedom and fullness of life. Central to the biblical account of the visitation is the dialogue between the two women. It is from this mutual exchange of proclamation and attentive listening that the power of the encounter is manifest. A true dialogue is a journey whose end is unknown and which leads to conversion and growth. Dialogue in the spirit of the visitation fosters a culture of mutual trust and understanding between the individuals. A culture of dialogue, or the art of conversation, requires the freedom to be attentive to the voice of God, the other, and the self. In the apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, and the two papal encyclicals, Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis has placed before the people of God a clear call to look at our world and to walk with our brothers and sisters in greater consciousness of being interconnected and responsible for the life and the future of the world. Throughout the COVID pandemic, he has reminded us that we are all in the same boat, tossed by the unexpected turbulent storm of the pandemic. While the boat may be the same, the pandemic has shown that not all passengers are similarly affected. We have concerns about healthcare, economic and social inequalities. Educational systems worldwide have felt the effect of the pandemic at every level. Recent statistics from international agencies have led some to speak of an educational catastrophe, with an additional 10 million children being forced to leave school as a result of the economic crisis caused by the coronavirus. In Evangelii Gaudium, the Pope invited the whole church to be on an outgoing mission, to be open to all places, on all occasions, without hesitation, reluctance, or fear, so that no one can be excluded. The outgoing church is an enterprising community that can influence all processes of our personal and social life. We sense the challenge of finding and sharing a living together, of mingling and encounter, of embracing and supporting one another, of stepping into this flood tide, which, while chaotic, can become a genuine experience of fraternity, a caravan of solidarity. We are invited to take care of the fragile, our sisters and brothers, and the earth upon which we live. This is an invitation to all men and women. Education and formation are key priorities to help individuals to become direct protagonists and builders of peace and the common good. In the encyclical letter Laudato Si, Pope Francis reminds us that education will be inadequate and ineffectual unless we strive to promote a new way of thinking about being human beings, life, society, and our relationship with nature. Now more than ever, in a world torn by social conflict and lacking a common vision, there is an urgent need for change. The Pope calls for the development of an integral and inclusive education that is able to engage in patient listening and constructive dialogue. He calls us to a transformation that enables future generations the opportunity to build a future of hope and peace. Both Evangelii Gaudium and Laudato Si call for the creation of a village of education capable of forming a network of open and human relationships. According to an African proverb, it takes a whole village to educate a child. The Pope insists that it's necessary to first create a village before we can educate. First, the ground must be cleared of discrimination, and fraternity must be allowed to flourish. The contemporary context in which we find ourselves today can be described in 5 different areas. As Pope Francis clearly states for us, everything is connected. So each of these aspects are also very intimately related to one another. Reflecting on the current global reality, Pope Francis stated, education requires entering into sincere and genuine dialogue with young people. They are the ones who, above all, make us aware of the urgent need for that intergenerational solidarity, which has sadly been lacking in recent years. There is, in fact, a tendency in many parts of the world to be self-absorbed, to defend acquired rights and privileges, and to view the world within a narrow horizon that treats the elderly with indifference and no longer welcomes the newborn. There is a growing rift between generations, between different peoples and cultures, between rich and poor parts of our population, some growing increasingly richer, and the majority growing increasingly poorer. The rift between males and females, between economics and ethics, between humanity and planet Earth. Therefore, the kind of education needed today must be able to confront the new idolatry of the self and find the right words to give back to all the originality and beauty of the human vocation. Pope Francis emphasizes the word together. Only with efforts across generations and across borders can this divide be bridged. As indicated in Laudato Si', although training requires constant growth and therefore change, the speed with which human activity has developed contrasts with the naturally slow pace of biological evolution. I would also add psychological and social evolution. The internet and social media are radically altering both relationships between human beings as well as individuals' wishes and identity development, affecting the human abilities such as memory, creativity, or the ability to focus and be introspective or reflective, capable of seeing the mysterious network of relationships between things. And so it sometimes solves one problem only to create another. We must be careful to realize that the virtual world can allow access to every corner of the planet, but it can also contribute to the globalization of indifference, which makes us slowly immune to the suffering of others and closed in on ourselves. Pope Francis never fails to remind us that discernment is essential. He is a true Jesuit. We need people who can pass this attitude on to future generations. The kind of education we need today does not fear the complexity of reality, but strives to help the young to dwell in its complexity and humanize it. For many young people today, their attention is constantly filled with rapid and multiple stimuli, which makes it difficult to learn to live in silence. The time and space that youth need to become familiar with their own wishes and fears is replaced with addictive virtual interactions that entice them and create alternative worldviews. They are caught up in calculating the rationality of how, and not the rationality that responds to the profound meaning of things and life, the rationality of why. In this incredible wealth of stimuli, the young suffer from a profound loss of interiority and a growing difficulty in pausing, reflecting, listening to themselves and to another. The diversity and speed of digital stimuli often leads to a loss of appreciation for the whole and for the relationships between things and for the broader horizon, which then becomes irrelevant. Pope Francis suggests that it's necessary to focus today on educating the questions of our youth rather than providing answers. He calls educators to dedicate time and space to the development of the great questions and wishes that dwell in the heart of a new generation, who from a serene relationship with himself might search for the transcendent. The issue of a fragmented identity or the difficulty to develop a unified vision of the self affects many young people today. In Laudato Si', Pope Francis raised the concern about the throwaway culture. He warns that the throwaway culture affects both excluded human beings and things. Those most affected by the throwaway culture are the elderly and children. From the consumeristic rationale, the elderly are discarded because they no longer are productive, while children are discarded because they are not yet productive. A society that casts the elderly aside is a society that refuses to address its past, its memory, and its roots. The elderly are wisdom sources. The elderly need to speak with the young, and the young speak with the elderly. They have the wisdom of the village. On the other hand, casting children aside reveals a lack of hope, vision, and future, since children bring their way of seeing reality with a trusting and pure gaze. Human identity is fashioned by reflection on the past in order to shape the future. We need others to help shape our personal identity, to offer both memory, perspective, and hope. It is necessary to form individuals who can rebuild the broken connection with our memory and our hope for the future. The drive toward a renewed educational commitment to interiority and identity requires an unbroken connection with the wider social, cultural, and environmental context surrounding it. Laudato Si' clearly identifies that human beings and nature must be considered in their interdependence, because the human environment and the natural environment deteriorate together. We cannot adequately combat environmental degradation unless we attend to causes related to human and social degradation. The lack of care for our inner being is reflected in the lack of care for the exterior. Disregard for the duty to cultivate and maintain a proper relationship with my neighbor, for whose care and custody I am responsible, ruins my relationship with myself, with others, with God, and with the earth. This happens if we no longer speak the language of fraternity, and we no longer recognize the beauty in our relationships with the world. Pope Francis calls for the development of an integral ecological education. The environmental challenges refer to a more radical relationship change, which for the future of our planet and and for our own life is at stake. I'd like to pause for a minute, just allow all of those different global perspectives to move deeper into you. See what's being touched in your heart. Working from the global worldviews, the Global Compact on Education is characterized by 5 fundamental themes. We shift from the problems confronting humanity and touch on the inner hopes and desires that fuel this movement to reimagine an educational plan for the future. Pope Francis asks us to commit to a global compact on education. He does not suggest an educational action, nor does he invite us to develop a program, but he focuses on a compact, or more specifically, on an educational covenant. The choice of these words reveal much about the style the Pope invites us to undertake. For there to be a compact, there must be 2 or more people who choose to commit to a common cause. A compact implies choosing to put our strength at the service of the same project while maintaining our mutual differences. A compact implies the ability to see others who are different from us as our traveling companions, and not as threats to our identity, to see in them the image of God. The term covenant in the Judeo-Christian tradition refers to the bond of love established between God and his people, a love that in Jesus breaks down walls between people and reestablishes peace. The Pope invites us to look for traveling companions on the path of education. Rather than suggesting programs to follow, he invites us to establish a covenant among all those who value the uniqueness of each individual through a continuous commitment to formation. Therefore, we must say that respecting diversity is the first premise of this educational covenant. A global compact for education is based on the contribution of all to address the educational emergency that is before us. Fraternity is the cultural concept that underpins and guides Francis's papacy. Introducing fraternity into educational processes, the Pope means recognize it as a basic stance from which all other terms gain their meaning. The lexicon of fraternity engenders relational terms: encounter, solidarity, mercy, generosity, along with dialogue and reciprocity. Recalling that life transcends every single man and woman, and therefore is not something that is self-produced, but it is given by someone else. The origin story of Genesis calls us to recognize one another as children of the one and only Father. We are brothers and sisters who are called to mutual benevolence and stewardship. Today's throwaway culture is deeply rooted in the repeated rejection of fraternity. We lack an awareness of our common origin, of our mutual belonging, and of a future to be shaped with everyone. Today, in view of the establishment of a global village of education, this principle has based oneself at the service of fraternity is a testament to the full attainment of our shared humanity. We have been created not only to live with others, but also to live at the service of others in a salvific and enriching reciprocity. If we desire a more fraternal world, we need to educate young people to acknowledge and appreciate, love each person regardless of their physical proximity, regardless of where he or she was born or lives. According to Pope Francis, the fear of diversity is the root of the fragmentation felt in our world today. It is the source of conflict and political unrest. The first step to build a new humanism is to educate people to a new way of being that recognizes unity and diversity, equality and freedom, identity and otherness. Diversity offers a horizon of possibilities. Unity and differences are not mutually exclusive. On the contrary, they imply one another. Therefore, we must engage in thinking that expresses unity and diversity and considers differences as a blessing to our identity and not an obstacle to self-fulfillment. In educational practices, this new thinking leads to broad dialogical exercises that freely involve everyone who wishes to work towards a culture of encounter, mutual enrichment, and fraternal listening. When we engage in dialogue, we learn to accept others and their different ways of thinking, living, and speaking. We can join one another in taking up the duty of serving justice and peace. The critical relationship in the educational process is the student-teacher relationship. The Global Compact calls for placing the human person at the center of the experience. Young people look to the words and examples of adults. Let us remember that the young have much to offer, thanks to their enthusiasm, thirst for truth, and commitment to learn. A fruitful education experience does not primarily depend on the preparation of the teacher or the skill of the pupil, but on the quality of the relationship that's established between them. If education is to be a mutual and liberating activity, it's not the teacher who educates the pupil in a one-way transmission, nor do pupils alone build their knowledge, but rather it is their relationship that educates both teacher and pupils in a dialogical exchange. We are very aware that the social and political situation of many young people in the world is far from ideal. While the primacy of the person is essential to the compact, we must also be willing to open our eyes to the real situation of poverty, suffering, exploitation, denied possibilities. This is the world in which many of our young people find themselves. Are we willing to be disturbed by this disparity? Pope Francis reminds us that we must always act by connecting our head and our heart, and then our hands. The Global Compact on Education is an invitation addressed to all who have political, administrative, religious, and educational responsibilities. This is a time to listen to the cries that arise from the depths of the hearts of young people. It is a cry for peace, a cry for justice, a cry for brotherhood, sisterhood. a cry of outrage, a cry for responsibility, a cry against the throwaway culture. Everyone, especially those engaged in education, must find the strength to nurture a revolution of tenderness. This will save our world in its many wombs. Are we willing to risk face-to-face encounters with others, to stand with their joys, their pains, and their pleas? Can we call for a change that models a responsible lifestyle so that others may have the opportunity to have life? Let us once more pause and allow what we've just heard to settle a little deeper within us. As we take a look at the mission of the Global Compact on Education, I'd like to return to the concept of the educational village. In the Global Educational Village, the motivation is to integrate and respect all peoples, to unite formal studies and everyday life. It calls for us to involve teachers, students, and their families, and to call upon civil society in its intellectual, scientific, artistic, athletic, political, business, and charitable dimensions. The Global Educational Village builds an alliance between the Earth's inhabitants and our common home. This alliance generates peace, justice, and hospitality among all peoples of the human family. It respects and protects the earth and is open to dialogue between various faith communities. To reach these global objectives of a shared journey as an educating village, Pope Francis calls us to act with courage and to move forward. He offers us 3 steps in this process of moving forward. First, he calls us to have the courage to put the person at the center. For Pope Francis, the mandates of Laudato Si are intimately connected to the mission of the Global Compact on Education. To put the person at the center of the educational process, we must agree to promote formal and informal educational processes that do not ignore the fact that the whole world is deeply interconnected. Pope Francis calls for the development of an integral education that gives a central place to the value of each creature in its relationship to the people and realities surrounding it. This education advocates for a lifestyle that rejects the throwaway culture. Education aimed at creating an ecological citizenship can become an effective instrument to build a more welcoming society that is focused on the care of others and of creation, and it has a long-term outlook. To educate a child, a dialogue is also needed between families, schools, religions, associations, and social societies to help pursue this common goal. Secondly, we need the courage to demand the best that we have today. A new compact on education needs the strength of all of society. It needs to be proactive and confident in opening education to a long-term vision that is unfettered by the status quo. This will result in men and women who are open, responsible, prepared to listen, able to dialogue and reflect with others, capable of weaving relationships with families, between generations, and with civil society, and able to create a new humanness. Thirdly, we need the courage to educate, to serve. Are we ready to call people to put themselves at the service of the community? Educators cannot fully succeed unless they're committed to form and shape their students to be open to serve one another. Service is a pillar of the culture of the encounter. It means bending over those in need and stretching out a hand to them. We do this without calculation, without fear, with tenderness and understanding, just as Jesus knelt to wash the feet of the disciples. In serving others, we experience there is more joy in giving than in receiving. In this regard, all institutions must be ready and willing to examine their aims and methods and determine how shall they carry out their educational mission. There are 7 commitments for the Global Compact on Education, and I would just like to briefly highlight each of the 7. The first commitment is to make the human person the center. To make human persons the center of every educational program in order to foster their distinctiveness and their capacity for relationship with others against the spread of the throwaway culture. This commitment calls for the respect and the enhancement of each person's identity without discrimination. Secondly, there is a call to listen to the voices of children and young people. Listening to their voices, we help to build together a future of justice, peace, and a dignified life for each individual. Thirdly, to advance women, to encourage the full participation of girls and women in education. It is important that there is the recognition that women have the same rights, dignities, and equalities. Hopefully, through the greater participation in inclusion programs, women will move into more decision-making levels in society. Fourthly, to empower the family. To remember that the family is the first and essential place of education. Parents need to be part of the decision-making bodies in the education of their children. And the promotion of family-friendly policies are specifically needed for the most socially and economically disadvantaged families. Their voice needs to be heard. Fifthly, to welcome, to educate and be educated on the need for acceptance, to be open to the most vulnerable and the marginalized. Welcoming and integration of the vulnerable and marginalized people is of the highest priority. Sixthly, to find new ways of understanding economy and politics, to be committed to finding new ways of understanding the economy, politics, growth, and progress that can truly stand at the service of the human person and for the entire human family in the context of an integral ecology. Sustainable development and commitment to building the common good through a social covenant is at the core of this theme. Seventhly, to safeguard our common home. To safeguard and cultivate our common home, protecting it from exploitation and moving towards renewable energy and respect for our entire environment. The Pope calls us to an integral ecological stance. Throughout his papacy, Pope Francis has met with universities, especially the Catholic universities. In the construction of the global educational village, Catholic universities will be carrying out scientific research in 5 thematic areas that are the cornerstones of Pope Francis's goal for universities. There is a reference university for each of these topics: dignity and human rights at the University of Notre Dame, fraternity and cooperation, the Catholic University of the Sacred Heart in Italy, technology and integral ecology, the Pontifical University in Colombia, peace and citizenship at the Pontifical Lateran University, culture and religion at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas in the Philippines. The major source that I used for the preparation of this talk came from the website for the Global Compact on Education. It is an interactive site where various groups that are working together can share information, share resources, begin to build the global educational village. Taking a little from Visitation Spirituality, I invite us to take a look at a few questions for reflection and possible ways in which we can then enter into conversation. So what roads might you be invited to accompany youth on their educational journey? With what you have heard tonight, what's challenging your hearts? What companions do you need to walk this journey to deeper fraternity and sorority for the life of the world? With that, I'm going to stop my screen share.